Hi, my name's Scott Ritter. In the 1980s, I was commissioned as an officer in the United States Marine Corps. I specialized in intelligence. And in 1987, I was assigned to the On-Site Inspection Agency, which was put together to go into the Soviet Union and oversee the implementation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This was the first time that on-site inspection had been used as part of a disarmament verification process, and so I was one of the groundbreakers in developing on-site inspection tactics, techniques, methodologies, etc. With this experience in 1991, at the end of the Gulf War, I was asked to join the United Nations Special Commission, which was tasked by Security Council to oversee the disarmament of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. And from 1991 to 1998, I served as a part of that team as a chief weapons inspector, and I led a number of teams into Iraq and was heavily involved in the disarmament process. I resigned from that position in 1998 out of frustration that between Iraq and the United States, we weren't being allowed to do our job as weapons inspectors. And later on, I spoke out against the war in Iraq, citing that while we may not have been able to verify Iraq as being in 100% compliance with its obligation to disarm, we had disarmed Iraq sufficient to know that the case for war being made by the United States, that Iraq retained a significant weapons of mass destruction capability, was not the truth, and that we were going to war on the basis of a lie. And I've been speaking out on disarmament issues ever since.
Well, we are glad to have you with us, Mr. Ritter. Your expertise is crucial. Now, you've been speaking out more recently about, the use of chemical weapons in Syria and the way in which we're getting the information. And I wonder if you could lay out, you have some questions about what the current wisdom is. The Syrians did it. Everybody was sure enough, I guess, to bomb Syria before they sent inspectors over there. Could you take a look at this from your perspective and tell us what your thinking is?
Well, sure. There's a lot of similarities between the Syrian case and the Iraqi case, namely that both nations possessed weapons of mass destruction. Iraq had a significant program, and we came in and we're seeking to disarm it. Syria had a very large chemical weapons program. In 2013, there was an incident in the suburb of Damascus called East Ghouta. It's the same suburb where the current controversy is taking place. The allegations were that the Syrian government had used sarin nerve agent against civilian population. The Syrian government denied that, but as a result of that incident, the international community got together and basically compelled Syria into signing the Chemical Weapons Convention, declaring the totality of its chemical weapons holdings, and then opening itself up to be disarmed, by inspections that were carried out by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW. Russia was the nation that was tapped to be the guarantor of Syria's compliance, and that comes into play today. But the bottom line is Syria had the weapons, but was verified by 2016 by the OPCW as being in 100% compliance. That means that the totality of Syria's chemical weapons program was eliminated. Now, at the same time that this disarmament process is taking place, Syria is being engulfed in a civil war that's taken on very nasty proportions. Some people label it a humanitarian crisis. The bottom line is over 500,000 people have died, and it's a war that pits the Syrian government against a variety of anti-regime forces, including many of which are Islamic in nature, the Islamic State, al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, and others. Some of these Islamic factions were in the suburb of East Ghouta. They've been there since 2012. And earlier this year, the Syrian government initiated an offensive to liberate that area, to rid it of these factions. It was very heavy fighting. Thousands of civilians were killed, massive aerial bombardment. But the Syrian government was prevailing. And by April 6th, it looked as if the militants were preparing to surrender and agreed to be evacuated to rebel-held territory in North Syria. So at the moment that the Syrian government is prevailing, at the moment that the Syrian army is about to win on the field of battle, suddenly the allegations come out that there was this chemical weapons attack. Now, it's not a massive chemical weapons attack. We're not talking about, the kind of World War I military assault. It's dropping one or two so-called barrel bombs, which are improvised devices that contain chlorine gas canisters, and according to the militants, between 40 and 70 people were killed, up to 500 people were made ill by this attack. And because of this attack, the United States and other nations picked up on this, saying that this is proof positive that Syria has been lying about its chemical weapons program, that Syria has retained a chemical weapons program, and that Russia has been behind Syria's retention and continued use of this. And this is the case that the United States made to launch this missile strike that took place last week. And there's a lot of problems with this scenario. Again, the logic of it. Why would the Syrian government, at the moment of victory, use a pinprick chemical attack, an attack that had zero military value? It added nothing to the military campaign, and yet invites the wrath of the West at a critical time when the rebels were desperately begging for Western intervention. So there's a number of people that believe, that, including the Russians and the Syrian government, that this was a facade, that this was fake, that this was a staged event. There has been no hard evidence put forward by anybody that an attack took place. In fact, Russia, because shortly after the allegations of the attack occurred, the entire town of Douma, which is part of the East Ghouta suburb, was taken over by the Syrian army. All the rebels were evacuated. And the places that were alleged to have been attacked were inspected by Russian chemical weapons specialists, who said there's just zero trace of any chemical weapons activity here. Now, the international community mobilized, the same inspectors that oversaw the disarmament of Syria were mobilized to go back to Syria and do an investigation. They were supposed to start their work this past week, and in fact, they arrived in Damascus the day after the missile strikes occurred. And at the moment, these inspectors are still trying to get to the sites, because as soon as the missile strikes occurred, there were certain militant groups left in the suburbs that took heart at the fact that the West had intervened. And so instead of laying down and allowing themselves to be occupied, they've taken arms back up and are, sniping at the Syrian army and causing trouble in hopes that the West will intervene. And these groups opened fire on a reconnaissance team sent by the United Nations to inspect whether to decide whether or not the site was safe enough for the inspectors to come in. So to date, no inspectors have been there. So no hard evidence has been collected by anybody except the Russians, who have said there's literally nothing here. The United States, France, and Great Britain have all admitted that the only evidence they've used to rely upon to launch this attack were the photographs, the images, the videotapes sent to them by the rebel forces, whom the Russians say are staging this event. So I have great concern about the United States basically carrying out an attack on a sovereign nation, void of any hard evidence that something worthy of military action actually took place. But the longer we wait, the longer it takes to get inspectors onto the site, the more countries like the United States, France, and Great Britain are going to say that the Russians have sanitized it, that, of course, there won't be any chemicals found there because they've been cleaned up. And so there'll be a lot of uncertainty put out there. But the bottom line is there shouldn't have been uncertainty going into military action. Why the rush to action? Why the rush to the attack? And I believe it's because the last thing the United States wanted was inspectors to get on site and carry out a forensic examination, which would have found that a chemical attack did not, in fact, take place.
It's sort of like at a police crime scene, sort of going in and, sweeping the place up and getting it real clean and neat before you check for that which you're looking for. I mean, it seems absurd to bomb the place that you want to preserve so you can figure out what happened.
Well, they actually didn't bomb the United States didn't bomb the site that was attacked. They bombed 3 other facilities that were empty, and it's ironic. One of the facilities is in the suburbs of Damascus, a major metropolitan area. And if you listen to the American generals who were briefing the American public, they said that they believed that there were quantities of nerve agent there. And so in a building in a metropolitan area believed to contain deadly nerve agent, what do? Blow it up. And if there was in fact nerve agent there, it would have been released into civilian populations, resulting in many hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths. The fact that nobody died is probably the clearest evidence yet that there was no nerve agent there. That the United States is just guessing, we're just making it up, and that's ultimately one of the travesties of this whole thing, is that we can no longer trust our military. We can no longer trust our politicians. We can no longer trust our intelligence services. They will manufacture whatever narrative they need to manufacture to justify an action that they deem to be politically expedient. This isn't about defending the truth or even acting in genuine national security interests. This is about an action that was deemed to be politically convenient for the president at a time when he was going through some domestic trouble. And the military went along with it, and that's just a darn shame.
Well, now, isn't it also the case that there were problems with the allegations in terms of Syria using gas and whatever in 2013, and then again in 2015? I believe the New York Times had to retract their 2013 story about Syria. You have any information on that?
Many people, there was a rush to judgment. In 2013, they put out a story about, many thousands of people dying, and that it was done definitely by the Syrian government. But later on, it turned out that the number of dead, and I'm not trying to, belittle death. That's the last thing I do. One death is a tragedy, but the fact is, the world was shocked by the many thousands of people who are said to have died, and the fact is, the number of dead was far less than that. The incident was far smaller than what the New York Times and others were reporting, and moreover, they claimed that the attack could only have been carried out by the Syrian government, and it turned out that the weapon systems that were used were most probably in the possession of the rebels, and that this again was a case of the rebels staging a chemical attack in order to get the world to intervene on their behalf. And a similar scenario unfolded last year in the village of Khan Sheikhoun, where the Syrian government dropped 2 or 3 bombs on the village, and suddenly there's a claim that there's sarin nerve agent and chlorine gas wafting through the village, killing scores of people. Videotapes were taken of, dead and dying and suffering people, and these images prompted President Trump to intervene. An investigation was carried out, but the only evidence that was ever collected, the weapons inspectors never went to the actual site that was attacked. They claimed that it was too late and was unsafe. Instead, they relied upon evidence that was collected by the rebels. So there's no chain of custody. And I have to tell you, as a weapons inspector who's done numerous forensic investigations, chain of custody of any samples that are to be used as a part of your investigation is an absolute. You have to be at the site when it's collected, and has to be certified to be in your possession throughout the period of time to the laboratory. And any break in the chain of custody makes that evidence meaningless, useless for a legitimate investigation. So we have evidence being collected by the rebels. They claim that they were doing it using, training, and they videotaped themselves, strangely enough, collecting the samples. They had hazardous material suits. And to the layperson looking at it, they said, look, they're dressed up in hazmat suits, and they're collecting it. But, just one of the many problems is the training, the hazmat suits they were using were training suits, meaning that they're absolutely useless when it comes to real protection, that this was, like almost everything else involved with these rebels, a staged event, an act of theater to promote the idea that something real is happening. And the bottom line is that attack was probably another staged event by the rebels to get the United States and other nations to intervene. And again, we see the same scenario playing out this past 2 weeks, where
who was supporting these rebels? Who which rebels, who's backing this particular group?
Well, the group that's in we have two issues here. One, we have the rebels, the actual fighters, and they're the Jaish al-Islam, or the Army of Islam, which is a Saudi-backed Salafist fundamentalist group, extraordinarily brutal. They captured thousands of Alawites and government supporters, women and children, put them in cages throughout the city, daring the Syrians to bomb them. Executed thousands of people. They behead people. Just not a good group. Those are the fighters. Embedded within the fighters are a variety of Western-trained and Western-funded non-governmental organizations, such as the White Helmets. They've achieved some bit of notoriety. A film made about them was nominated for an Academy Award. There's another group, the Syrian American Medical Society, which alleges to operate hospitals in these zones. But both of these groups, their primary function isn't rescue in the case of the White Helmets, or medical care in case of SAMs, but rather anti-regime propaganda. They seem to exist for the purpose of fabricating, or sometimes maybe accurately reporting, atrocities committed by the Syrian government for the sole purpose of ginning up support within the West for regime change, that is, getting rid of Bashar al-Assad. And many of the reports that came out of Douma, the Syrian city involved in the allegations of chemical attack recently, these reports originated from the White Helmets and from the Syrian American Medical Society and other NGOs of that ilk.
You bring up chain of custody, and I guess that's what was most ridiculous about bombing instead of sending inspectors. The first thing you would want to do is establish a chain of custody and sort of nail down the so-called crime scene, right? To investigate. That's what normal process would be, right?
Well, again, as somebody, a part of my resume is that I was a participant in the Gulf War, and if you go back in time and remember, we spent the first bulk of that war conducting a massive aerial campaign against Iraq, and I was one of the people who helped, come up with the target list that we used to attack. Each target had to have a purpose. You don't just bomb willy-nilly. You'd bomb this target, and you'd have to explain why we're bombing this target. What is the military purpose of this target? What effects do we desire to achieve, and why do we want to achieve these effects? So now we take that, the way you're supposed to fight a war, and we bring it to Syria last week. We bombed 3 targets. One was a research facility in Damascus, and 2 were, bunker facilities in western Syria. All 3 were claimed to be involved with a Syrian chemical weapons program. Wait a minute, the Syrian chemical weapons program was eliminated, verified as being disarmed. So what program are they talking about? Then they say, the American officials who briefed the American people, they claimed that one of these stored sarin nerve agent and precursors and chemical production equipment. Now, that's a very specific statement. Now, if Syria was confirmed in 2016, verified as being disarmed with all this material eliminated, what are they talking about? What evidence do they have that any of this material exists? They just make it up, and that's what's going on. That's the travesty of not allowing the investigation to take place. For instance, if you had sent inspectors in, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that had I been a member of that inspection team, I would be able to tell you with 100% certainty what took place at that site. It wasn't that long ago that the allegations took place. There are very good forensic investigation techniques that can be applied. The technology, the science is sound, and we'd be able to reverse engineer that site and tell you exactly what happened, when it happened, and how much of it happened. Was there chlorine used? Was there sarin nerve agent used? Was there something else taking place?
Wow.
That's the level of specificity that would have occurred. And then based upon that, let's say an inspection team had gone in, and we found that there was sarin nerve agent. Now the United States government can say there's not supposed to be any sarin nerve agent in Syria. Therefore, we can state that the Syrians have a covert, undeclared sarin nerve agent capability. But still, you don't know where it is, so now they would have to say, we assess it could be in this bunker. But they don't have absolute knowledge. We bombed empty buildings. That's the bottom line. We didn't bomb any. We didn't degrade Syria's chemical weapons capability. They don't have one. They got rid of it. We were among the nations that certified them as being disarmed. We just created this phantom threat out of nothing, so that we could attack Syria, so that our president could be seen as being presidential, as being a leader, as being a commander-in-chief at a time when his credibility was being attacked on the home front on a variety of different issues.
Amazing. That is a couple of mouthfuls, but it really helps clarify the situation. Of course, it leaves us terrified. It scares the hell out of me because it's it's like, where's the truth? We are so far away from the reality of the situation, in a situation that is so dangerous that it is almost hard to imagine.
Well, I tell you, as an American citizen who happens to be empowered with knowledge about how weapons inspections work, how decisions are made about war, etc., I'm disillusioned beyond belief at this point in time, because not only were we lied to by the president. I mean, it's not to be the first time a president has lied to the American people, but we've been lied to by military officers who were supposed to be above that. They're supposed to be professionals. We were just told blatant lies by Marine Corps officers, a former Marine Corps four-star, Secretary Mattis, General Dumford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General McKenzie, the director of the Joint Staff. These are three Marine officers who stood before the American people and told bald-faced lies about what was going on. We've been lied to by Congress. They're supposed to be the people's representatives who provide a check and balance against executive overreach. But Congress has, either abrogated their responsibilities to ensure that they're consulted prior to war, or they just go along as witting, willing participants in the lie. And we've been lied to by the media, by the majority of the American media. When you turn on the television at night, you don't have journalists. There are no more Seymour Hersh's out there trying to dig up the truth. We have a bunch of paid mouthpieces who sit there and repeat that which the government tells them without question. And so Donald Trump can say there are chemical weapons in Syria. The generals parrot his terms. Congress nods its head dumbly, and the mass media repeats it over and over again to the American public. And what's the average citizen to do? I mean, they're not empowered. They didn't spend decades doing arms control like I did. They weren't part of a war planning cell, so they don't know the insights into that. They trust their elected officials. They trust the media to try and report fact-based information to them, and they're not getting it. And it's a very sad state of affairs.
And just a slight correction, you can read the incredible work of Seymour Hersh, but you have to go to the London Review of Books because he can no longer get published in America.
Right, correct. Oh, I'm good friends with Cy, so I know he's been published in the London Review.
No, it's just a point of information.
But, you don't have a Cy Hersh at the New York Times anymore.
Right, exactly.
The New Yorker no longer has a Cy Hersh quality journalist. Instead, we get, these...
Let's just say it this way. These idiots who make a few calls to the back rooms of the White House, talk to some aide who wants to be quoted, and then they come on television and they talk for 3 hours about less than nothing. Is that about right?
That's about it.
I think we're going to have to leave it right there, Scott Ritter. Again, we appreciate the information and the experience behind that information, because we know you know a hell of a lot about what you're talking. I guess you're pretty worried that we might end up in a shooting war with Russia at this point?
Well, I tell you what, a week ago I was very worried. If I'm going to give kudos to Jim Mattis, it will be as such. he took the desire of President Trump and John Bolton to create a major crisis with Russia over the allegations of Syrian chemical weapons use, and he was able to water that down into a one-time shot where we put on a show for the American people, but we did nothing. I mean, we warned the Russians in advance. There was no danger to the Russians. The Syrians lost nothing. They didn't even suffer any casualties. We blew up 3 empty buildings. We spent $250 million of American taxpayer money, and we get to pat ourselves on the back and tell everybody how great we are. But we avoided a needless confrontation with the Russians, and I'm a lot more calmer today about the potential of a shooting war with Russia than I was a week ago.
All right. We're going to leave it there. Thank you, Scott Ritter, for being with us on Flashpoints.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye now.